When she sang her first hymn, the piano player fell off his wooden bench. The bench broke my fall some, didn't save my dignity any. I remember the exact board. It was third plank from the left, cracked at the end, always rocked a hair if you sat too far to the right. I'd been sitting too far to the right for 11 years. Knew that bench the way I knew my own breathing. And still I went off it like a man who'd never met gravity. There were 16 people in that church when it happened. I know because I counted them afterward, lying there on the floor with splinters in my palm and sawdust in my collar, needing something to do with my mind besides feel every one of those 16 pairs of eyes on the back of my neck. 14 of them laughed. One of them, Harlan Prout, who was 73 and half deaf and asleep through most of the sermon, didn't laugh because he didn't wake up till the bench hit the floor. And one of them didn't laugh at all. My name is Calvin Hoop. I played piano at First Methodist in Carver's Crossing, New Mexico Territory, from 1881 until the autumn of 1893. Before that I played in a traveling show, 2 saloons, a hotel lobby in Santa Fe that smelled like cigar smoke and bad perfume, and one very short engagement at the governor's residence that ended when I accidentally played a waltz at what was meant to be a solemn occasion. Before all of that I was a soldier, but that's a different story, and it goes in a drawer I don't open much anymore. By the time I came to Carver's Crossing, I was 41 years old, worn smooth in some places and rough in others, and about as necessary to the world as a hat rack in a barn. I had a room above Hector Vasquez's hardware store. I had a cat that came and went as it pleased and answered to nothing. I had a coat with 2 buttons missing that I kept meaning to replace. I played for Sunday service and for the occasional wedding and for the Christmas program in December, which was the only time of year more than 8 people showed up and actually listened. The Reverend, a small, tight man named Osgood who ironed his collar so stiff it left marks on his neck, paid me $3 a month plus use of the instrument for practice. I accepted this arrangement without complaint because complaining requires a certain faith that things can be different, and by 1889 or thereabouts, I had mostly run out of that. I was adequate. That's the word I would have used for myself if I was being generous. The congregation of First Methodist in Carver's Crossing needed adequate. They needed someone to play the opening hymn and the closing hymn and the offertory, and to do it in roughly the right key without stopping in the middle to rest his hands. I did all of that. I showed up on time. I didn't drink before noon on Sundays, which is more than some men could say. Nobody thought about me much. That was fine. I had stopped expecting them to. She arrived on a Wednesday. I know it was Wednesday because I was there practicing. The Reverend let me use the piano on Wednesday afternoons when nothing else was scheduled, and I was working through a piece I had no occasion to play, something I'd heard once in St. Louis that I couldn't get out of my head, slow and wide open, nothing a church in New Mexico Territory had any use for. The door at the back opened. I didn't stop playing. People came in sometimes to pray or to get out of the wind, and they never bothered me and I never bothered them. I kept my eyes on my hands and my mind on the chord I was trying to find, the one that sat just at the edge of what the piano could do if you coaxed it right. Footsteps, not in a hurry, measured. Then they stopped somewhere in the middle of the pews, and I heard her sit down. I finished the passage and let the last chord die out, and then the church was quiet except for the wind under the door. I still didn't turn around. I was thinking about the next section of the piece, the part where the left hand has to do something harder than it looks, and for a minute I forgot she was there. That's not in any hymnal I've ever seen. The voice was even, not unfriendly but not soft either. Woman's voice, middle years, not local. She had a slight pull on certain words that I couldn't immediately place. I said, "No, ma'am, it isn't." "It's pretty." I turned around then. She was sitting 4 rows back, wearing a gray dress and a hat with no particular decoration, and her hands were folded in her lap the way a woman folds her hands when she's decided not to fidget. She was maybe 45, maybe a little older. Brown hair going to silver at the temples, a face that had seen weather and hadn't apologized for it. Her eyes were the color of creek water in September, not quite brown, not quite green, something in between that changed depending on the light. She looked at me the way you look at something you're trying to figure out without being rude about it. "Thank you," I said. "Are you the regular piano player here?" 11 years. She nodded like that meant something to her. "I'm Nora Aldridge. I'll be taking over at the schoolhouse come Monday." Reverend Osgood said I might speak to you about the Sunday music. About the Sunday music. I sing, she said. I sang at my church back in Virginia for 9 years. I thought if you weren't opposed, I might sing a hymn or two on Sundays, if the congregation would have it. I looked at her. There was no performance in the way she said it. No apology, no elaborate explanation. She just said what she wanted the way some people say the weather. I'd have to hear you first, I said. Something moved across her face. Not quite amusement, something a notch quieter than that. That's fair. She stood up and came forward and stood beside the piano, and I played the opening bars of Come Thou Fount, which I'd played so many times I could have done it with my hands asleep. And she sang. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I've heard men describe a woman singing like it was lightning striking a tree, like the Lord himself came down and played the air like an instrument. And most of the time that's the kind of talk that comes from men who have not heard a great deal of music and are confusing beauty with surprise. So I'll say it plain. She had a voice that was big without pushing, warm in the low notes and clear at the top, and this is the thing I couldn't account for, honest. Some singers are skilled, some are pleasant, some you can hear from the back pew without straining. Nora Aldridge had all of that, and then this other thing underneath it, this quality I can only describe as meaning it. Every note she sang, she meant it all the way through. I played the whole hymn through, then I played it again because I didn't want to stop. When it was done, she looked at me and waited. Sunday, I said, you can sing Sunday. She nodded. She picked up her hat, which she'd set on top of the piano while she sang, and put it back on her head. I appreciate it, Mr. Hoop, Calvin Hoop. Mr. Hoop. She said it the way you say a name when you intend to remember it, like she was filing it somewhere specific. Then she walked back up the aisle and out the door, and I sat at the piano for a while after she left, not playing anything, just sitting. The cat was outside, scratching at the door of my room when I got home. I let it in and put water on for coffee and stood at the window looking at the street, which was empty and dry and ordinary, the same as it always was. I went to bed at my usual time. I didn't sleep much. Sunday she stood up beside the piano in her same gray dress. She had a second one, I'd notice later, a darker gray for winters, and she sang A Mighty Fortress. I was watching my hands like I always did, staying out of her way the way a good accompanist should, giving her the bottom and the middle and leaving the top for her. 14 people in the church that morning, which was ordinary for early October. By the third verse, I noticed that Harlan Prout, who I had never once seen take his eyes off the Reverend during a service out of some stubborn sense of protocol, was watching her instead. By the end of the hymn, everyone in the room was watching her. And then the Reverend took the pulpit, and the moment was over, and ordinary life reasserted itself. But it had happened. You could feel the shape of it in the air even after. She didn't look at the congregation while she sang. She looked somewhere above them and ahead, like she was singing to something they couldn't see. But she looked at me when she started, just for a second, the way a person checks that the door is still there before they walk through it. I held my end up. I always did. The second Sunday she sang, Great is thy faithfulness. Third Sunday she sang, What a friend we have in Jesus. By the fourth Sunday I had started learning what she was likely to choose. She had an inclination toward the older hymns, the ones with some age on them, where the words had been worn smooth by 100 years of mouths, and I started preparing specific arrangements. Not elaborate, just thoughtful. A different voicing in the left hand. An inner voice she could lean against if she needed room. Small things that took time to work out, but that she probably never noticed. She noticed. About 6 weeks in, she came up after service while I was closing the piano lid, and she said, You changed something in the third verse last Sunday, the chord under grace. I said I had. She said it was better. 2 words, said the way she said everything, level without decoration. But she'd heard it. Out of everything happening around her, the Reverend's droning sermon and Harlan Prout's occasional cough and the wind at the windows, she'd heard that one chord change, and she'd noticed it was better. I said, Thank you. She said, You're very good, you know. I looked up from the piano lid. She was watching me with that three-quarter look, patient and direct. I said, Adequate. No, she said, Good. She picked up her hat and left. I stood there by the piano for a minute with my hand still on the lid. The church was empty by then, just me and the benches and the light coming through the high window, going gold and long the way October light does. I didn't know what to do with what she'd said. I put it in my coat pocket like something I'd found on the ground and couldn't identify yet, something I needed to look at later when I had more time. She came on Wednesday afternoons after that. Not every week, once or twice a month. She'd come in while I was practicing and sit in her same pew, fourth row, left side, and listen. Sometimes she'd ask me to play something again. Sometimes we'd run through a hymn she was thinking about for Sunday. Sometimes she'd sit there for an hour without saying a word and then stand up and leave, and I'd keep playing, and neither of us made anything of it. I started looking forward to Wednesdays, in a way I hadn't looked forward to anything in a considerable while. That's the thing I didn't let myself examine too closely in those months. I knew it was there the way you know a fire is in the next room. You can feel the heat through the wall without looking at the source. I'd been alone for long enough that I had built a kind of architecture around it, learned where the walls were, learned not to push against them. A woman like Nora Aldridge, steady, capable, with a voice like that and eyes like that, and a way of saying a thing that made you feel the thing had been considered, was not for the likes of Calvin Hoop, who had 2 buttons missing on his coat and a cat that didn't answer to its own name, and 11 years of playing hymns to the same 14 people. I knew that, I accepted it. I was grateful for Wednesdays. The Christmas program in December had 26 people, which was more than I could ever recall, and by January the Sunday count was up past 20. Reverend Osgood, who was not a man who expressed enthusiasm easily or often, did once say to me that the music had improved considerably, and I took that as the monument of praise it was intended to be. What he didn't say, and what I understood, was that people were coming to hear her. Fine, that was fine. I knew what I was. I was the foundation. I was the thing underneath that made her sound the way she sounded. That was useful. That was enough. Then January turned to February, cold and brown. The kind of February that makes you wonder what you're doing in New Mexico territory instead of somewhere sensible. And on a Wednesday afternoon, she came in and she didn't sit down. She stood in the aisle and she said, "Calvin." First time she'd used my given name. I looked up from the keys. "I heard that you played in the governor's reception," she said, "in Santa Fe before you came here." "That's true. And before that, a hotel." "For 2 years, yes." She was looking at me carefully, not unkindly, the way she looked when she was working something out. "And before that, the traveling show." "3 seasons." "And before that," she said, "you were in the war." I put both hands in my lap. "That's been a few years." She walked forward slowly and sat down at the end of the front pew, closest to the piano. Not 4 rows back, right there. I could have reached out and touched her arm if I'd been a different kind of man. "My husband was too," she said. "He came back, he wasn't the same after." A pause. "He died in '87, heart, the doctor said. I think it was something else that wore out first." I didn't say I was sorry because she hadn't said it for pity. She'd said it so I'd understand something. "After he died, I kept the school in Lynchburg for 4 more years, she said. "Then my sister married and didn't need me, and I thought I'd try somewhere new." She looked at me. "Why here?" I said. "They needed a teacher." A small pause. "I needed to be needed." The wind pushed at the high window. A board somewhere in the roof shifted the way boards do in the cold. "I listen to you play," she said. "Not just on Sundays, on Wednesdays when you don't know I'm here yet, before I come in." She stopped, started again. "You play differently when you think no one's listening." My hands were still in my lap. "How so?" "Like you mean it," she said, "all the way through." She said it exactly the way I'd said that about her voice in my own mind back in October. All the way through. I hadn't said it out loud. I hadn't said it to anyone. But she'd found the same words for the same thing. I looked at her. "You've been here 11 years, she said. "How long have you been playing like no one's listening?" I thought about it. 11 years, I said. She nodded slow, like I'd confirmed something she'd already worked out. Then she said, "I think that's long enough. I'm going to take a minute here and say something about the nature of a man who has been alone for a long time. Because there's a kind of, I don't know what to call it, a kind of careful life you build. You build it out of routine and adequacy and not wanting too much, and after a while the life fits you like a coat that's been washed too many times. It's not uncomfortable, it's just small." And then something pulls at a thread. I didn't say anything back to her for a long moment, not because I didn't have anything to say. Because there was too much, and I didn't know which piece of it to hand her first. And I was afraid of being wrong about what she meant. And I was 43 years old, and I had not been wrong about being alone in a very long time. She waited, that was something about her, she wasn't impatient. She had a quality of stillness that wasn't cold, that was just room. She left room. I said, finally, "What do you mean long enough?" She said, "I mean I've been listening to you play for 4 months, and I think you are a remarkable man, and I think you have decided to be unremarkable, and I would like to know why." Nobody had ever said that to me, in my life. Nobody had ever sat down and looked at me straight and said a thing like that. I didn't know what my face did. I know I looked down at the keys for a second. I know I put one hand back on the piano, just resting it there, not playing, just needing something solid under my palm. "I'm not remarkable," I said. "Calvin," her voice was very even. "I have been in 7 churches in 3 states. I have sung with 7 different piano players. Not one of them played the way you do. Not one of them heard what I was doing well enough to change a chord in the 3rd verse to give me room." She paused. "You think I didn't notice every change? I noticed every one." I kept my hand on the piano. "You have been here 11 years, she said, "playing for 14 people and calling yourself adequate, and I want to know what happened that made you decide to do that." The cold was in the boards underfoot. The high window had gone blue with late afternoon. I said nothing happened. I just stopped expecting anything different. She was quiet for a moment. "Well," she said, "I'm different. I am going to be honest about the next part. I was not graceful about it. I am not a graceful man by nature. I'm better with my hands than my mouth in most situations, and this was the situation I was least equipped for of any I could name." I said something about not wanting to presume. She said she wasn't offering me a presumption, she was offering me a conversation. I said I was considerably past the age where conversations like this generally led anywhere useful. She said she was not young herself and had no patience for that particular kind of false modesty. I said something about being set in my ways. She said she wasn't asking me to change my ways. She was asking me to sit with her sometime and see what it was like. "Sit with you where?" I said. "Dinner," she said. "Saturday. There's a place on Main that does a decent meal." I looked at her, she looked back. I said, "All right." She stood up and picked up her hat and put it on. 7 o'clock. She started up the aisle and then she stopped and turned around. "And Calvin, fix the 2 buttons on your coat. You've had 2 missing since October." She walked out. I sat at the piano for a good while after. Saturday we had dinner. She had the lamb. I had a beef stew that was better than it looked. We talked for 2.5 hours, about Virginia, about New Mexico. About the war, she asked carefully, and I answered carefully, and we left the worst of it where it lived, which was the right thing to do. About music, at length. She had opinions about music that were strong and specific and largely correct, and she wasn't interested in having them agreed with out of politeness. At one point, she said something about a hymn I'd always found awkward, and I disagreed, and told her why, and she thought about it, and said I might be right about the bridge, but I was wrong about the verse. And we went back and forth on it for 20 minutes, and I can't explain what it was like to argue about something and have the other person actually push back. To have someone at the table who was not going to simply agree with me to keep the peace. She was the first woman in years who had treated me like a man worth disagreeing with. We walked back in the cold and she stopped at her door, which was 2 streets from mine, and she thanked me for dinner with a handshake. A real one, firm and direct, not the soft thing some women do when they're being polite. She shook my hand like I was a person she respected. I walked home in the cold, and I felt like something had cracked open inside my chest in a way that didn't hurt exactly, like a window that hadn't been opened in a long time. Spring, we had dinner on Saturdays when the weather allowed. We started taking walks on Sunday afternoons after service, out past the edge of town where the land opened up and you could see for miles, the flat brown plain going to purple at the far hills. She liked to walk fast. I've got long legs and it was still work keeping up with her. She told me about Virginia, the school she'd built from 30 students to 60 in 4 years, the garden she'd kept, kitchen garden mostly, but some flowers, the way her husband had been before, the ease of him, the way he could walk into a room and make it larger by being in it. She talked about him without grief and without apology, the way you talk about a good country you've left. It was there. You came from it. You don't forget it, and you don't pretend you do. I told her things I hadn't told in a long time. About the war, some of it. About the hotel in Santa Fe, the 2 years I'd spent playing music for people who weren't paying attention, and how that had started to feel like a summary of my life. About coming to Carver's Crossing because the Reverend had offered, and I had no particular reason to go anywhere else. She listened the way she sang, all the way through. One Sunday afternoon in April, out on the plain, she stopped walking and turned to look at the hills and said, "Are you happy here, Calvin?" I thought about it. "Happier than I was," I said. "That's not quite what I asked." The wind came across flat ground, warm for the first time that year, carrying the smell of something green just starting. "I'm happy on Sundays," I said. "And Wednesdays and Saturdays." She looked at me sideways. There was that thing on her face, the thing a notch quieter than amusement, the thing that had been there the first day. "That's 3 days out of 7, she said. "It's the most I've managed in a while." She started walking again. Her shoulder was close to my arm, not touching, close. "We can probably do better than that," she said. "I want to tell you about one evening in May. It was a Wednesday, late, and we had been at the church working on the music for the spring program. She wanted to add a piece, something I hadn't played in years, and we'd been at it for 2 hours and we'd gotten it right, finally, the arrangement she heard in her head, and she stood beside the piano flushed from the effort of it with a strand of hair that had come loose from its pin, and she laughed. Not a polite laugh, a full one with her whole face, at something I'd said about the bass line being contrary as a mule in January. I think I fell in love with her then. I think that was the specific moment I stopped arguing with myself about what was happening and admitted it. She looked down at me at the piano. She was standing and I was sitting, and her face settled into something quieter, and she said, "You know you are the best musician I have ever heard play the piano." I said, "You can't know that." "Calvin," she said, "I have been listening to you for 7 months. I'm a church piano player in a small town in New Mexico territory." She put her hand on my shoulder. Just her hand, flat and steady, the way you place a hand on someone's shoulder when you want them to stop moving and hear something. "You are," she said, "the best musician I have ever heard play the piano, and you are also a church piano player in a small town in New Mexico territory. Both of those things are true at the same time." I looked up at her. "You've been hiding in the second one," she said, "for a long time." Her hand was still on my shoulder, warm and steady and there. I put my hand over hers. Neither of us moved for a minute. The lamplight made everything amber and small, and I could hear the clock behind the pulpit and the wind outside and nothing else. Then she sat down on the bench beside me. It was a longer bench up here, the good one near the piano, not the cracked one in the 3rd row. And she didn't move her hand, and I didn't move mine, and we sat like that in the warm lamp quiet until the candle on the Reverend's pulpit burned all the way down. "You asked me about the bench. The bench I fell off of was back in October. I should have told it straight, but that's not how memory works. It goes where it wants and then circles back. And this story wanted to start where the falling started, not where the bench was. It was the first Sunday she sang. A Mighty Fortress, 4 rows back when she'd still been sitting in the congregation to sing. I was playing with my eyes on my hands the way I always did, not watching, just playing, and then her voice rose up on the 3rd verse and did that thing it did, that thing I've been trying to explain the whole time here, that quality of meaning it all the way through, and something happened in my chest that I was not prepared for. My hands didn't stop, my hands kept playing. But my weight shifted, and the bench shifted, and the cracked end of the 3rd board went one way, and I went the other, and I was on the floor on my side with my cheek on the sawdust, and my coat up around my ears before I fully understood what had happened. I lay there for a second. The piano was still ringing from where I'd caught the keys on the way down. 14 people were staring. Harlan Prout was still asleep. And she had stopped singing, and she was looking at me, and she was the only one in the room not laughing. She was looking at me with a steadiness that, even from the floor, even in that moment, felt like something different from pity. She was looking at me like a person who was seeing someone they intended to know better. I got up, I straightened my coat. I sat back down on what remained of the bench. shifted my weight left where it was solid, and played the fourth verse. She sang it. Here's the part nobody saw. After the service, she waited until everyone else had filed out, waited through the Reverend's announcements, through Harlan Prout being woken up by his nephew, through the ladies who stayed to straighten the hymnals. She waited until it was just her and me. Then she walked up to the piano. She said, "Are you hurt?" I said my pride, maybe. She said, "The bench has been like that for at least 2 years. I noticed it the first day I came in. Someone should fix it." I said I'd meant to get to it. She said, "Mr. Hoop." I looked up at her. "It's a good thing," she said, "when a piece of music surprises you." She said it with perfect evenness, without a trace of cruelty, and without a trace of softness either, just as a plain statement about the nature of things. Then she put her hat on and walked out. I sat at the piano a long time after. I didn't play, I just sat. In the spring, she married me on the 3rd Saturday in April, in that same church, on a morning when the light came through the high window and made the whole room gold. Reverend Osgood performed the ceremony in his ironed collar. Harlan Prout was in the front row and awake the whole time, which I took as a sign of the occasion's significance. We had 41 people at the service. She wore a dress that wasn't gray. I had fixed the buttons on my coat. And I played before the ceremony because she asked me to, and because there was a piece I'd been working out in my head since October, since that first Wednesday in the empty church. A piece that was my own, not from any hymnal or hotel lobby or governor's reception, something I'd built from the ground up in small pieces over 7 months until it was done. I played it all the way through. She stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder, and listened. When it was done, she said, "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." I told her she was biased. She said, "Calvin." And when she says my name like that, level and exact, with that particular weight she puts on it, I know she means what she says all the way through. So I believed her. I still do.